Mi nombre es Jeffrey Herlihy-Mera, soy profesor en el Departamento de Humanidades y es un gran gusto tener esa oportunidad de presentar a nuestra primera charla magistral de ese congreso con Marta Aponte Alsina. Pues Marta Aponte Alsina es la persona a quien tengo el placer de presentar y su ponencia es titulado That Fertile Darkness, Mayagüez, the Mother and the Poet. Marta Aponte Alsina es autora de novelas, relatos y ensayos. Su dedicación constante al oficio de escribir y la calidad de su trabajo le han ganado un lugar en la literatura del Caribe y América Latina. En 1994 publicó la novela Angélica Furiosa. Siguieron El Cuarto Rey Mago, Sopa de Letras, 1996, finalista en el certamen de novela Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. La Casa de la Loca, 2001, Vampiresas, 2004, Fúgate, 2005, Terranova, editores 2009, El Fantasma de las Cosas, Sobre mi Cadáver, 2012, Mr. Green, Random House, La Muerte Feliz de William Carlos Williams, 2015, Somos Islas, 2015, Puerto Rico 3 Aguirre, 2018. Sexto Sueño recibió el Premio Nacional de Novela otorgado por el Pen Club de Puerto Rico. En 2014 le fue otorgado la cátedra Nilita Pintos Gastón, que confiere el programa de estudios de mujer y género de la Universidad de Puerto Rico. Editorial Dragomani publicó en 2015 la versión italiana de Sobre mi Cadáver. Ha sido editora de libros y revistas, entre ellos la antología Narraciones Puertorriqueñas, publicada por la Fundación Biblioteca Ayacucho. Cristina Rivera Garza la incluyó en una selección de 12 autores imprescindibles de América Latina, publicada en revista Publishers Weekly en 2018. Editorial Canadaya, en Barcelona, publicó una nueva edición de La Muerte Feliz de William Carlos Williams. En 2022 se publicó su novela Los Botánicas Alemanes. Y en noviembre de 2023 publicó su novela Borinquen-Field. Muchas gracias, Marta, por compartir con nuestra comunidad.
Bueno, muy buenos días. Se escucha, se oye en todas partes. Como Jeff habló en español, yo los voy a castigar con mi ponencia en inglés para que todos aquí presentes, que somos duchos en inglés boricua, y los invitados traten de entendernos. Se llama That Fertile Darkness, Mayagüez, the Mother and the Poet, y la coautora de esta ponencia es la genealogista Rosana Duchesne Winter. Ella me ayudó a localizar mucha información genealógica sobre los Williams, sobre Raquel en particular. First of all, thanks to the William Carlos Williams Society for the loyalty to a strong and sensitive poetic universe. If ever in time there has been a need for ecstatic beauty, it is the present. It has always been the present because wars between peoples and nations are always sadly present. In Henry James' short novel, The Aspern Papers, the solitary worship of a poet becomes a malignant obsession. But when readers gather to share their findings, always somehow new, although acknowledging readers from times past, they generate an enriching aura. So thank you and welcome to one of the homes of the poet's imagination, his mother's birthplace. In the year before William Carlos Williams' birth, one of the great Latin American writers of the 19th century, Alejandro Tapia y Rivera, died in San Juan, Puerto Rico. I am not suggesting a fast-forward reincarnation on one poet into the body of another poet, a future poet, but rather a locational timeline, a comparative bridge between intellectual spaces to be crossed by means of Williams' favorite human virtue, imagination. In 1882, Virginia Woolf was born in London. That creature never quite understood by our poet. In 1883, Franz Kafka was born in Prague. And this year is the centenary of his death, no? The centennial year of his death. Okay. When such events are viewed as interwoven histories without closing accesses or establishing hierarchies, their connections are revealing. And Williams is, above all, a poetics of connections, trapping the qualities of a place at a given moment. Williams' ancestors were transatlantic and trans-Caribbean migrants. But here in Mayagüez, his maternal grandparents stayed long enough to raise a family of modest means and exceptionally gifted children in the fields of science and the arts, which the poet would blend in his own practice. At the time of William Carlos' birth, Rutherford was a new town emerging from a land planning project with the functions of a suburban satellite community. In contrast, Mayagüez, founded in 1760, was by 1847, the year of his mother's birth, a bustling commercial hub, surviving a great fire, the first of several catastrophic events. By means of unending economic and social activities that sponsored new urban forms and designs. In its initial stages, it was the small urban center and port of a plantation economy based on intensive slave labor. By mid-century, its buildings, handsome houses, and warehouses had been built and rebuilt several times, thanks to the work of enslaved persons, poor persons classified as white, and free people of color, merchants, and artisans. I wrote the first paragraphs of this conference a million years ago, no? In a luminous and cool Monday morning in December. As I glanced out of the window at the mountains in the background and the wild trees, I felt close to Williams' method of writing. The following quote is from Coda in Hell. This was written by Williams. That which is past forever, and no power of the imagination can bring it back again. Yet, inasmuch as there are many lives being lived in the world, by virtue of sadness and regret, we are enabled to partake to some small degree of those pleasures we have missed or lost. Cierra la cita, and elsewhere. The quality of a place in a poetic moment brings forth an aesthetic embracing everything involved: climate, geographic position, relative size, history, other cultures, as well as the character of its sands, flowers, minerals, and the condition of knowledge within its borders. Cierra la cita. In a present of wars, universal panic, barbaric accumulation of wealth by the few, and environmental destruction, one is tempted to think that the fabric of life is beyond repair. But when Williams published The Great American Novel in 1923, and when Virginia Woolf published Mrs. Dalloway in 1925, and Joyce, his Ulysses, in 1922, and Luis Pérez Matos, his first Afro-Caribbean poems, I think they were writing as spirited survivors of the first mad global apocalypse of modern times. Family legacies are acknowledged throughout Williams' work. in his poetry, essays, novels, and plays. The most outstanding statement of those legacies is Yes, Mrs. Williams, 40 years in the making, and published in 1959 to the astonishment and incomprehension of critics, although he perhaps ironically, considered it one of his finest works. The words of a mother collected by a son who was, in a sense, a stranger. Many analogies can be made to Williams' method, archaeological explorations, the search for erased traditions in the writings of diasporic intellectuals, the final memory of a land and a people in a body that gave birth to a poet, a joyful temperament clouded by sudden melancholic moods may have been the lesson of the mother, and the anxiety of disconnection that provoked by her strangeness and her trances. The mother was not quite human. She was a place of wonder, desire, and caution. The first line of the second paragraph of Williams' autobiography reads, "Terror dominated my youth, not fear." A cryptic play of words granting terror the stature of a master. Terrorized by the exotic trances of the mother, without being aware of the fact that the modern spiritualist movement was an American invention, with chapters around the world. Spiritualism, for the most part, associated with progressive causes such as women's suffrage and the abolition of slavery, came into being not very far away from the William Hoheb household in Rutherford. Mayagüez was also a regional and island-wide center of the spiritualist movement since the 1870s, and also of Freemasonry, with the establishment of the Logia Yagüez in 1813. In 1903, the Federación de Espiritistas de Puerto Rico was founded in Mayagüez. Previously, Iris de la Paz, a periodical managed by women, was launched here in Mayagüez to spread the word of a movement of spiritualist freethinkers. However, there were explicit limits. Another sort of spiritualism was associated with trances and tremors and irrationality. It had old popular roots and was rejected as indomitable, irrational, and dangerous. And William's mother, as remembered by her son, was an unpredictable, undisciplined, lonely medium overruled by her trances. A chaotic force to be both respected and dreaded. It seems that her only interlocutor was the often absent husband, and his long observers deepened her sense of loneliness. His long absences deepened her sense of loneliness even in the realm of spirits. Her ordeal may have been the force invoked by Williams in Subterra, the macabre first poem of his second book, and I quote, "The spirits of the underground." Be it as it may, I have read that the Americanization of the Williams Hoheb family, a proof of their will to become a normal American family, led them to convert from housebound spiritualist seances to the Unitarian Church. I don't know what a normal American family is, but according to testimonies, the spirit world of Raquel accompanied her to church. In our first visit to Rutherford some years ago, Paco, who is here, my husband, and I had a memorable experience. We parked at the opposite side of the street facing the Williams Hoheb house on West Passaic Avenue. A young man approached us and said, "Yes, that is it." We told him we were Puerto Ricans. He went to ask his mother, the present owner of the house, the then owner of the house, and came back saying that she would receive us. She showed us the living room of the house, uncannily identical to the one pictured in all photographs, and the backyard with a very old twisted grape plant. On the ceiling partition between the living room and the dining room, there was a painting of a building resembling a Caribbean plantation house. As we left, we saw the stairs leading to the second floor. That was off limits, but still the owner was kind enough to let us know that the spirits of previous generations, including the Williams, Hohebs, and Dickinsons, I guess, were satisfied with the living bodies of the present owners. I know, she said, because my husband is sensitive and he has seen them. That was a beautiful closure for a remarkable evening. This brings us back to Williams and his mother's biographer. In a sense, it was an attempt to understand and honor the scattered memories of the mother, the poet as his mother's medium. Beyond that, and in a post-colonial studies fashion, the book may be read as a haunting, the return of a colonial territory to haunt the metropolitan space. The light here is not very clear, so In 1941, months before U.S. involvement in the Second World War, Williams was invited by the University of Puerto Rico to a Pan American Writers' Congress. This event deserves at least a chapter on the subject of the intellectual history of Pan-Americanism and the role assigned to Puerto Rico. The meeting's coordinator was the poet Mona Lee, the first wife of the man who was to be. After the war, Lee, while working at the State Department, would continue her role as a promoter of Pan-Americanism, a foreign affairs strategy long since filed and forgotten. One purpose of the intercultural meeting of writers was to establish a climate of mutual understanding between intellectuals and artists across the hemisphere. In preparation for these visits of luminaries, Mona Lee delivered several lectures, one for each North American writer. Later, Nilita Vientos Gaston, a leading Puerto Rican intellectual, wrote about the visitors. In her estimation, the outstanding star of the lot was Archibald MacLeish. During this visit in 1941, reporters described Williams as a poet, novelist, doctor, and embryonic biographer, alluding to his plans to write a biography of his mother. A note was published in the official publication of the University, La Torre, a bilingual review. It stated that Williams had accepted the invitation provided he was granted time to visit Mayagüez, his mother's birthplace, to complete a biography he was writing. Also, that he had contacts with several of his relatives on his mother's side, and most importantly, that his mother would be accompanying him to the conference on her first trip to her birthplace since leaving in 1978. She never did, and another fact stands out. At the time, Williams told reporters that the book was almost completed. It has been acknowledged that the eccentric presence of his mother, whom he both adored and understood to the point of exasperation and cruelty, was one of the driving forces of Williams' instinct as a poet devoted to recording the aura in things, from the humblest object to the dialects of the street, and to his insistence in expressing their values, and that with remarkable speed and constant openness, without distraction, eyes and words synchronized. Sight seems to have been the dominant sense. the gift of the visual artist. So Raquel Elena Rosa Hope her poetic gift as a painter and as a sensitive medium could be conceived, and I quote, as the mother source of a considerable stream of U.S. American poetry. I think that Yes, Mrs. Williams deserves an annotated edition so that it is no longer branded as a minor work or a trivial capriccio. The names Paradis, De Castro, Cruz, Pardo, Queratriz come back to haunt us and claim our attention. Searching in local archives, I found that Raquel Elena was an appreciated amateur opera singer in her 20s. A charity concert is reviewed in La Razón, a local Mayagüez newspaper, for July 15. It says, Miss Elena Hoheb, sweet Elena, sang for us Nabucco's soprano aria, receiving enthusiastic applause. Then Astol and the sweet Elena gave us the tasty harmonies of I due Foscari, a soprano and tenor duet. It should be noted that Astol, sweet Elena's companion, was considered a leading actor and singer in the theatrical scenarios of the Spanish Antilles and Latin America. It should be also noted that a close friend of Elena's, Ernestine de Queratri, also sang at this benefit concert. Ernestine and Pauline de Queratri are important characters in the last part of Yes, Mrs. Williams, as is their grandmother, the Comtesse de Queratris. Their father, Ernest de Queratri, was indeed an extraordinary character, a nobleman, a French nobleman who supported the French Republic and led an adventurous life in Venezuela and Mexico. Okay, back to the theater. Religious plays were staged in Mayagüez in the 1820s in more than one language, including Afro-Caribbean Creole. The city's first modest provisional theater was built in 1834, and by then amateur musicians played Mozartian airs and Rossini overtures. Operas and concerts were staged in Mayagüez in at least the early 1840s. By mid-century, there was a level of accumulated wealth and generalized musical sensibility that sponsored international operatic and theatrical companies and visiting luminaries such as the composer and pianist Louis Moreau Gottschalk and the soprano Adelina Patti, both mentioned by Williams. Dr. Carlos Hoheb Williams, Elena's brother, returned to Mayagüez in 1871 with his diploma from the University of Paris and opened his doctor's office at his home in Calle de Mirasol 57, where he offered free consultation for the poor. He's mentioned in a published letter written by a grateful mother explaining how his dedication and knowledge helped save a small girl afflicted by pneumonia. Another clue about the family, the family's dwelling. 1873 was the year of the emancipation of enslaved persons in Puerto Rico. The genealogist Rosana Duchesne found that Elena's mother was still alive in 1872, and she was the owner of a slave whose name was Agustin. They lived in a quarter of the city known as Cárcel, close to the Catholic Church and the public square. In Yes, Mrs. Williams, Raquel Elena is quoted as saying that her parents' house was located at Mendez Vigo Street and that it bordered with a large estate owned by the Christies, a family headed by Juan Bautista Christie Lange, a French migrant, perhaps exiled from Haiti. Such details are both indicators of larger potential subjects, like the social status of the creolized Jews, French, Germans, and other nationalities. Another thread may be found in Raquel Elena's birth certificate, December 20, 1847. Her godparents were Manuel Pardo and Cecilia Prieto. They were most probably related to or the same person mentioned as Mrs. Pardo, in whose house Elena's mother stayed when visiting St. Thomas, indicating that the relations of the Hoheb with the father's birthplace and his religious community of converted or coerced Sephardic Jews were extended and enduring. Hence, the presence in her memories and in those of her mother-in-law of families of Jewish origins like the Monsantos and the Welcomes. Those were the dynamics of migrations and cross-cultural and extended relations between families. When Elena told her son that she did not wish to return to Puerto Rico because there was nothing there, perhaps she was referring to the Mayagüez of her childhood, or her remaining close relatives who no longer were always there. However, that was not entirely true, as we shall see. An enigma connected with the whole side of the family and Elena's only brother by both of her parents is the identity of the girl depicted in Portrait of a Niece in Mayagüez. According to Eric Williams, the poet's son, the painting was exhibited in the living room of the house at 9 Ridge Road. A handsome portrait in oil of a golden-haired young woman. Hours of trance-like communications via emails with Rosanna Duchesne suggested that if indeed it was painted in Mayagüez, the model must have been one of the 3 daughters sired by Carlos Hoheb in his first marriage to Elvire Chevalot. It is a charming painting by a woman who had left Mayagüez rarely and as her mother's companion and had yet to study with masters like Carolus Duran and Henner in France. And it suggests the existence of competent art teachers in the city, which after all was a market for itinerant photographers and itinerant painters, as notable as the American Elijah Metcalf, born in Massachusetts, who is known to have painted 9 portraits in Mayagüez in the late 1820s. ¿Dónde estarán? And indeed, the history of an educated woman painter born in a family of West Indian migrants established in Puerto Rico leads necessarily to the city where we are meeting today. It bears repeating that Mayagüez society was formed in part by an influx of exiles fleeing from the revolutionary Caribbean and Latin American wars of independence. It was a seaport with its own customs house, and by mid-19th century, with connections to South America and Europe, traveling connections. In short, an outward-looking, heterogeneous, and stratified society of planters, merchants, and laborers. And also, it was in Mayagüez, closer to Santo Domingo and Haiti, that descendants from migrants and older families conceived an independence movement and a confederation of the Antilles, preceded as early as the 1820s by conspiracies to establish here the capital of the República Boricua. Most of the city's social strata and activities are represented in Yes, Mrs. Williams. An outstanding character is Mellon Hoheb, her mother, Mellon Hoheb, Williams' maternal grandmother of Martinique descent, a poor widowed woman who could hardly support her son Carlos, a medical student in France, by competing with more powerful merchants. She had the business sense of a small segment of independent women vendors who were active in Puerto Rico until recently. In 1872, around the time of Elena's concert, a member of the Paradis family, José Paradis, perhaps the Pepe mentioned by her, established an export company in Puerto Plata, Santo Domingo, with local partners. He was one of the founders of the Puerto Rico Abolitionist Society in 1858, in spite of the fact that he himself was a slave owner with a questionable record in the treatment of slaves in the turbulent years after the Puerto Rican independence insurrection of 1868. Back to Elena's memories and the characters mentioned by her, indeed, Pedro Giacomagli's School for Boys existed and had more than 70 students. Andrés Guenat was a wealthy landowner with a plantation of 150 cuerdas. In Yes, Mrs. Williams are not only fragments of the social history of Mayagüez, but also of Paris in the late 1870s after the recovering bourgeoisie had crushed the Paris Commune, one of the first modern experiments in political organization by anarchists, socialists, and working class people. The briefest moment and the tiniest life are connected to a wider scale of history and myth. It remained for such an innovator as Williams to write about his fertile cultural background, and the life and gifts of his mother should be read as threads of that universe of ideas in microcosmic scales to be complete. More than now, when borders are controlled, and to use a metaphor by British Virgin Island poet Richard George, the Caribbean was a sea surrounded by islands. No limits seem to have impeded the regular travels and long stays of families such as the Monsantos, the Andustes, the Welcomes, the Hohebs, and the Hurars. Whereas, in spite, or maybe because of constant displacement, memories endured and came to us almost 100 years after the impressions on a young girl and by the agency of her son. A sense of place is condensed in images of Elena's childhood that can be found throughout her son's work: landscapes, plants, fruits, proverbs, music, persistence, and that. Williams' stay-at-home School of American Poetry was complemented by his family of wanderers on both sides. There is no question of Williams' attachment to his mother, nor of her constant sense of isolation. Her words were not fully translatable. They were rooted in close-knit modes of thriving or survival, secured by constant visitors. Carlos Emilio Hoheb, her oldest nephew, son of Carlos Hoheb and Elvire Chevalot, was born in France and as a young man settled in Ecuador. He visited Rutherford with members of his family as recorded in well-known photographs. Another nephew, Albert, stayed close to Raquel Elena. He became a doctor, settled in Rutherford, and covered for Williams' practice during the poet's travels in Europe. Mrs. Williams' brother Carlos married twice. In his second marriage to Rita Ayala, she gave birth to 7 children. 2 of them, Carlito and Raquel Carmen, are mentioned by Williams in his autobiography as having stayed at his parents' house when they were adolescents. More detailed portraits of 2 daughters of Carlos' marriage to his first wife are included in Williams' memories of the time he spent in Paris with his mother and brother. We know about Raquel Carmen that she never married and that she lived for some years in New York. Her sisters, Maria and Paulina, grew up in Puerto Rico. Both married Danish engineers, founding new branches of the Hoheb lineage in Denmark. Thus, in Williams' childhood, the writing impulse was formed among the murmurs of hybrid languages, a babel of languages and dialects connected to quoting the waters of the world. In some of Williams' words, the oceanic sadness of history, to quote St. Lucian poet Derek Walcott, involved Spanish conquerors, American revolutionary heroes, and the Jamaican sorceress Tituba into a poetics of connection somehow related to the threads of family history. From his father, his English origin, his childhood in St. Thomas, and his South American excursions, from both father and mother, the ghost of a place like the Caribbean region, formed by in and out migrations and multiple cultural ways of thinking, speaking, transforming, being transformed, and leaving a mark on the culture of empires, a power to be acknowledged. Williams himself wrote, "All the races of the earth mingled in the West Indies, it was not only a fact, it was at its best a revolution of sentiment and intelligence. I quote Williams' quote. I think we're almost there. The poet's Spanish-American roots and conflicts are the subjects of Dr. Julio Marsan's groundbreaking book. We know that for Williams, the first immersion in poetic sensibility was experienced at home, where Spanish, that perhaps is rarely spoken today, was the first language he heard, most probably interlaced with English vernaculars and French and English idioms. The oral Creole from the Antilles, linked to his genealogy, Mayagüez, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Martinique, Santo Domingo. Not all the hot threads led to happy results or picturesque adventures. Julio Hoheb, a son of Carlos Hoheb's second marriage to Rita Ayala, was enrolled as a student in the infamous Carlisle Indian School. Carlisle's shocking view of pedagogy as forced assimilation has been studied by Pablo Navarro Rivera. Julio entered at a 4th grade level and reached a 5th grade level. He arrived at Carlisle on May 2, 1901, and departed on April 16, 1905. As regards Williams' paternal genealogy, it is documented that his aunt, Rosita Welcome, was born in Ponce, Puerto Rico, and baptized in St. Thomas by the Ena family from Ponce. Her parents had met and married in New York. He was an itinerant photographer, and his name was not George, as reported by Williams' biography. He traveled throughout the Antilles and Suriname, offering his services and probably Guyana, selling his collections of images. His life and work is the subject of an ongoing research project by Rosanna Duchesne. Okay, on a previous visit to Mayagüez, I was impressed by the ongoing loss of patrimonial architecture. Fires and earthquakes gave way in recent times to not always adequate urban development designs. I can imagine Williams' disorientation when trying to locate his mother's house. Diasporic families carry an almost portable, self-centered biosphere, but they leave a trail of connections. Indeed, what I have been trying to communicate is that such connections are relevant in the life of a poet who struggled with identities. As Marsan has written, that struggle was one of the strong qualities of his temperament. The poet chose to stay at home in a small town of New Jersey. He did not follow the expatriates who were his friends and mentors, but maintained a connection with them, nurtured in part by his cosmopolitan cultural heritage. We have looked at some contacts with his mother's legacy, but she deserves further research for her own merits as perhaps one of the notable women painters of the Caribbean. Let us advocate for a formal, curated exhibition of Raquel Elena Hoheb Williams' paintings and drawings. In concluding, thanks to Jeffrey Herlihy, still here, for hosting this Congress, and again to Rosanna Duchesne Winter, who shared with me her research of the forking paths of Williams' maternal genealogy.
Me interesaba saber la conexión que él tuvo con la medicina y luego con la poesía, o sea, dónde estudió medicina, porque si le estudió en París, hay una fuerte probabilidad de que la influencia hacia la poesía le naciera en esa región, bueno, que sabemos que era la cuna, ¿verdad?, de las artes en todos los sentidos.
Estamos hablando del poeta.
Sí, del poeta.
Pues él estudió, bueno, obviamente debe haber una influencia muy grande del tío, del hermano de Raquel Elena, que también es mayagüezano, porque fue médico y un médico muy distinguido en Mayagüez y luego se estableció en Panamá y era muy apreciado por su sabiduría y por su generosidad, muy reconocido como médico. y amigo de Betance, del doctor Ena, que era el médico de Ponce, el padre de Ena. Y sin duda esa influencia del tío a través de la madre y la presencia del tío también, quizá llegó a conocerlo, porque el tío murió un poco después tendría unos 10 años. Tiene que haber pesado en su decisión de estudiar medicina. Pensó ser pintor, pero el talento no tenía, entonces fue como eliminando alternativas y estudió en la Universidad de Pensilvania, donde conoció a Ezra Pound, pero luego hizo estudios posgraduados en Alemania, en Austria, durante un tiempo, ¿no? Y finalmente era otra visión de la pedagogía de la medicina, quizás con 3 o 4 años las personas tenían un título. Él se especializó en pediatría. Dicen que dio a luz como a 3.000 niños, eso a mí me parece inverosímil. Y sí, yo veo un vínculo entre esa profesión del tío y que él se haya inclinado hacia ella.
A mí me gustaría saber qué fue lo que te inspiró a escribir tu primera novela hace años atrás. Me interesa, sí, del 1934, si me equivoco. Me interesa saber cuál fue tu inspiración.
Bueno, eso es como una... Yo entiendo que los cuentos familiares, ¿no? Cuando a uno le hablan de, mira, fulanita sanaba con plantas, o aquella joven salió del campo y a trabajar en la capital y nunca volvió, o pues las curas que se hacían, las tradiciones, y entonces eso, lo que falta es hacerle como, usar esos tejidos para hacer como una especie de tela, ¿no? Amplia, que eso es la novela, pero son detalles que impresionaron tanto en algún momento que piensas que debes rescatarlos. Como decía Williams de su madre, pienso que merece ser rescatada en este libro, a pesar de todos los conflictos de personalidad y cultura que ha habido y por haber que tuvo con ella. Había no solo un gran cariño, sino ella lo merece, parte porque es mi madre, me hizo a mí. Así que yo creo que ese fue un impulso, sí. Ese tejer, ese recuperar esas historias de la niñez y situarlas en un texto novelesco.